My children said I was too old to travel, so I went alone. Hi everyone! Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together, we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. At 67, I thought I knew what the rest of my life looked like. Tuesday grocery runs, Thursday babysitting duties, weekend family dinners, where I'd cook for 12 people and clean up afterward, while my children collapsed on the couch, claiming they were too full to move. I'd been following this script for so long that I'd forgotten there had ever been another version of myself, one who dreamed of cobblestone streets in Prague and sunrise over the Mediterranean. The travel brochure came in the mail by accident, addressed to the previous homeowner. Hidden Gems of Eastern Europe, a cultural journey through Prague, Budapest, and Vienna. I should have thrown it away, but instead, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table, studying every page. The photographs were stunning medieval castles, thermal baths, concert halls where Mozart once performed. There was something about the way the light fell across those ancient buildings that made my chest ache with longing. I'd wanted to see Prague since I was 22 years old and reading Kafka in my tiny apartment, before marriage and children had rearranged my priorities. David and I had talked about traveling to Europe someday, but someday kept getting pushed aside by mortgages and college tuitions and the endless needs of raising 4 children. After David died 3 years ago, I'd buried that dream so deep I'd almost forgotten it existed. But holding that brochure, I felt something stir inside me that I hadn't felt in decades. Want. Pure, uncomplicated want. I called the travel company that afternoon, my hands shaking as I dialed. "I'd like to inquire about your Eastern Europe tour," I told the cheerful young woman who answered. "Wonderful. It's a fantastic itinerary. Are you traveling with anyone?" "Just me," I said, and the words felt both terrifying and exhilarating. She walked me through the details. 14 days, small group tours, moderate walking required. It was expensive, more than I'd ever spent on myself in one go, but I had the money. David's life insurance, my own savings, the inheritance from my mother that had been sitting in a CD, earning almost nothing. Money I'd been saving for emergencies, or home repairs, or maybe a new car when the Honda finally died. But what if the emergency was that I was 67 and had never seen the world? I filled out the forms online that night after everyone had gone home, after I'd finished loading the dishwasher from Sunday dinner. Prague, Budapest, Vienna. 3 cities I'd dreamed about for 45 years. 3 cities I could finally see if I was brave enough to book the trip. I was reaching for my credit card when my phone rang. "Mom, we left Emma's math workbook," my daughter Karen said without preamble. "Can you drive it over? She has homework due tomorrow." I looked at my computer screen, at the booking form with all my information filled in. "Can't she do it without the workbook for one night?" "Mom, it's important. She's struggling with fractions already. Please?" I saved the form as a draft and drove 20 minutes across town to deliver a workbook to my 8-year-old granddaughter, who barely looked up from her iPad to thank me. It took me 3 more weeks to work up the courage to complete that booking form. I decided to tell my children about the trip at Sunday dinner, thinking they'd be excited for me, maybe even proud that I was being adventurous. I waited until dessert, when everyone was relaxed and happy. "I have some news," I announced, setting down my coffee cup with what I hoped was confident finality. "I'm going to Europe next month." The conversation stopped so abruptly that the silence felt heavy. "Europe?" Karen repeated, like I'd said Mars. "A tour through Prague, Budapest, and Vienna. I leave on October 15th. My son, Michael, was the first to laugh. "Mom, you've never been anywhere by yourself except the grocery store." "That's not true," I protested, though I couldn't immediately think of a counterexample. "Are you going with someone?" my youngest daughter Lisa asked hopefully. "No, it's a tour group, so I'll meet people. But I'm traveling alone." The looks they exchanged made my stomach clench. It was the same look they'd given each other when I'd insisted on driving myself to David's funeral, when I'd wanted to keep living in the house alone, when I'd suggested I might get a job. "Mom," Karen said gently, using the tone she reserved for her more difficult clients at the law firm. "You're 67. I'm aware of my age. These tours involve a lot of walking, a lot of navigating airports in foreign cities. What if something happens? What if you get lost or sick?" "What if I don't?" I shot back, but my voice came out sharper than I'd intended. "Mom, be realistic," Michael said. "You've never traveled internationally. You don't speak any foreign languages. You're not exactly the adventurous type." "How would you know what type I am? You've only known me as your mother and your grandmother. Maybe there are parts of me you've never seen." Lisa leaned forward, her expression earnest. "We're not trying to hurt your feelings. We just worry about you. What's brought this on all of a sudden?" I looked around the table at these 4 adults I'd raised, these people who knew me better than anyone in the world, and realized they didn't know me at all. They knew the version of me I'd become for them, the caretaker, the problem solver, the woman who put everyone else's needs first. But they'd never met the 22-year-old who'd read Kafka and dreamed of Prague, the woman who'd wanted to write poetry and see the world before she'd gotten distracted by their needs. "I've wanted to see Prague since before any of you were born," I said quietly. "I'm not getting any younger, and this might be my last chance." "There'll be other chances," Karen said. "Maybe when you're a little more prepared. Maybe with a companion. When I'm a little older, you mean? When I need a wheelchair and a full-time nurse?" "Mom, that's not what we're saying." "Then what are you saying?" The silence stretched until my oldest son, James, cleared his throat. "We're saying you're too old for this kind of adventure. It's dangerous and impractical, and frankly, it seems selfish." "Selfish? What about Emma's recital next month? What about Thanksgiving? What about when we need you?" The word hung in the air like smoke. Need. As if my value was measured entirely by my availability to solve their problems, babysit their children, provide free labor for their lives. "I've spent 45 years being needed by all of you," I said, my voice steady, despite the tears threatening behind my eyes. "Maybe it's time I needed something for myself." "This isn't like you, Mom," Lisa said softly. And that's when I realized they were right. This wasn't like the me they knew. But maybe that was exactly the problem. I canceled the trip the next day. Or tried to. I sat at my computer with the confirmation number, ready to call and forfeit my deposit, when something stopped me. Maybe it was the way Michael had laughed, like the idea of me being adventurous was inherently ridiculous. Maybe it was James calling me selfish for wanting one thing, just one thing for myself, after decades of sacrifice. Or maybe it was the mirror in my hallway, where I'd caught sight of myself that morning and seen a woman who'd forgotten how to want anything beyond other people's approval. I closed my laptop without canceling anything. The weeks leading up to my departure were miserable. My children treated me like I was having some sort of breakdown, calling more frequently to check on me, dropping by unannounced to make sure I was thinking clearly. Karen even suggested I talk to someone, a therapist or my doctor, about this sudden desire to travel alone. "It's just so unlike you," she kept saying, and every time she said it, I felt a little more determined to prove her wrong. I bought new luggage, got a passport renewal, studied phrasebooks for basic Czech, Hungarian, and German. I printed out maps, researched the hotels, read every travel blog I could find about solo female travelers over 60. The more I prepared, the more real it became. And the more real it became, the more terrified I was. What if they were right? What if I was too old, too sheltered, too dependent on the familiar routines of my small life to handle international travel alone? But then I'd look at that brochure, at those photographs of Prague's golden spires, and remember how it felt to want something so badly it made my chest tight with longing. I hadn't felt that way about anything in years, and I wasn't ready to give it up just because my children couldn't imagine me as anything other than their mother. 2 weeks before my departure, Emma got sick with strep throat, and Karen called in a panic. "Mom, I have a huge case going to trial. Can you take her for a few days, just until the antibiotic kicks in?" I almost said yes automatically, the way I always did. But then I remembered the travel insurance I'd bought, the non-refundable flights, the hotel reservations in Prague. "I can't," I said. "I'm leaving for Europe in 2 weeks, remember?" "You're still doing that?" The disbelief in her voice stung. "Yes, I'm still doing that." "But Emma's sick. She needs her grandmother. She needs her mother, and her father, and probably a babysitter you can afford to hire. Mom, please, just this once." "I've been saying just this once for 45 years, Karen. I'm going to Europe." She hung up on me. The night before I left, Lisa came over with a bottle of wine and an expression I recognized from when she was a teenager, trying to get out of trouble. "I brought a peace offering," she said, holding up the wine. We sat on my back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky, pink and orange, drinking wine and talking about everything except my impending departure. Finally, as the last light faded, she said, "Are you really sure about this, Mom?" "No," I admitted. "I'm terrified. I have no idea what I'm doing." "Then why are you going?" I thought about how to explain it, this feeling that had been growing inside me, like a seed finally getting water after decades of drought. "Do you remember when you were 16 and wanted to study abroad in France?" I asked. "You and Dad said no." "We said no because we were scared, because you were our baby and France felt impossibly far away, and we couldn't imagine letting you go somewhere we couldn't protect you." She nodded, remembering. "But you were furious with us. You said we were ruining your life, that we didn't trust you, that we were treating you like a child instead of recognizing who you were becoming." I was a dramatic teenager. "You were right, though. We were scared, and we let our fear make decisions for you. And now you're doing the same thing to me." Lisa was quiet for a long time, swirling her wine and looking out at the darkening yard. "I guess I never thought about you having dreams we didn't know about," she said finally. "I never told you about them. I was too busy making sure yours came true." The next morning, she drove me to the airport. We didn't talk much during the 40-minute drive, but when she hugged me goodbye at the departure gate, she whispered, "Have the most amazing time, Mom. Take lots of pictures." It was the first encouragement any of my children had given me, and I cried right there in the middle of the terminal. The flight to Prague was the longest I'd ever taken, with a layover in Amsterdam that left me exhausted and disoriented. By the time I dragged my suitcase through Prague's airport, I was questioning every decision that had led me here. The signs were in check, the announcements were in check, and I felt like an elderly Alice who'd fallen down a very expensive rabbit hole. The taxi driver spoke broken English, and I spent the 20-minute ride to my hotel practicing deep breathing exercises and reminding myself that millions of people traveled internationally every day without dying. But when I saw Prague for the first time, really saw it, not in photographs, but with my own eyes, something magical happened. The city rose around me like a fairy tale, all red roofs and golden spires and bridges that looked like they'd been painted by angels. The Vltava River curved through the heart of it like a silver ribbon, and everywhere I looked there were details that made me catch my breath. Wrought iron balconies, carved stone facades, narrow streets that seemed to lead to secrets. This was the city I'd dreamed about for 45 years, and it was more beautiful than I'd ever imagined. My hotel was small and charming, with a desk clerk named Pavel, who spoke excellent English and seemed genuinely pleased to help me navigate check-in. My room overlooked a quiet square with a fountain and a small cafe, where old men sat playing chess. I unpacked slowly, hanging up my carefully chosen travel clothes, arranging my toiletries in the tiny bathroom, and trying to absorb the fact that I was actually here. I'd done it. Despite my children's protests and my own fears, I'd managed to get myself to Prague. The tour group was meeting for dinner at 7, which gave me 2 hours to explore on my own. I changed into comfortable walking shoes, grabbed my camera and a map, and stepped out into Prague alone. The feeling was indescribable. For the first time in decades, I had nowhere I needed to be, except where I wanted to be. No one was calling to ask me to pick up milk or babysit or solve problems that weren't mine to solve. I was anonymous, invisible, free. I wandered through narrow cobblestone streets, past shop windows filled with crystal and marionettes, past bakeries that smelled like heaven and street musicians playing violin. I got lost twice and found my way both times, using a combination of my terrible Czech and the universal language of pointing at maps. When I finally made it to Old Town Square, I stood in the middle of all that medieval splendor and started crying. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when something inside you that's been locked away for too long finally breaks free. I was 67 years old, standing alone in Prague, and I felt more alive than I had in years. The tour group was small 12 people, ranging in age from a couple in their 40s to a woman named Dorothy, who was 81, and had been traveling solo since her husband died 15 years earlier. "First time abroad?" she asked when I introduced myself at dinner. "First time anywhere by myself," I admitted. She smiled. "Best addiction you'll ever develop. I've been to 37 countries since Harold passed." 37. 38 after this trip. My children think I've lost my mind, but I figure I've got maybe 10 good years left, and I'm not spending them knitting. I liked Dorothy immediately. Our guide was a young Czech woman named Zuzana, who spoke 4 languages and had the kind of energy that made you want to follow her anywhere. She laid out our itinerary for the next 14 days. Castles and thermal baths, concert halls and wine cellars, enough walking to cover half of Prague, but also enough free time to explore on our own. "Remember," she said, "this is your adventure. I'm here to help, but the best experiences often happen when you wander off the planned path." The first few days blurred together in the most wonderful way. I saw the Prague Castle, walked across the Charles Bridge at sunrise, listened to Mozart in the same concert hall where he'd premiered Don Giovanni. I ate goulash and drank Czech beer, and discovered that I actually enjoyed traveling with a group of strangers who had no expectations of me beyond showing up on time. But it was the moments alone that transformed me. The evening I spent sitting by the river, watching the sunset turn the castle golden. The morning I got up early and walked through empty streets, feeling like I had the entire city to myself. The afternoon I got lost, trying to find a bookstore, and ended up in a tiny cafe where the owner spoke no English, but somehow understood that I needed coffee and a quiet place to write postcards. I sent one to each of my children, carefully neutral messages about the weather and the food, and how beautiful everything was. I didn't tell them about the parts that mattered, how I felt younger and braver, and more myself than I had in decades. Budapest was even more magical than Prague, if such a thing was possible. The thermal baths felt like something from a Roman dream, and I spent an entire afternoon soaking in mineral-rich water while snow fell softly outside. I took a night cruise on the Danube and watched the Parliament building light up like a golden palace. It was in Budapest that I had my first real crisis. We were supposed to take a day trip to the Danube Bend, a scenic river valley with medieval towns and monastery ruins. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, but that morning I woke up feeling dizzy and nauseous. Nothing serious, just the combination of rich food, long days, and the exhaustion of processing so many new experiences. The smart thing would have been to stay at the hotel and rest, but I'd traveled 4,000 miles to see these places, and I was terrified that if I started giving in to physical discomfort, I'd prove my children right about being too old for this kind of adventure. So I took some medicine, drank extra water, and got on the bus. The day was a disaster from the start. The motion of the bus made me feel worse, and by the time we reached our first stop, a medieval castle perched high on a hill, I was fighting waves of nausea and dizziness. The tour guide announced we had an hour to explore, and I watched the rest of the group set off enthusiastically while I sat on a bench, trying not to throw up. That's where Dorothy found me. "Rough morning?" she asked, settling beside me with the casual grace of someone who'd learned to read people over 8 decades of living. "I think I might have pushed too hard," I admitted. "Ah, the classic mistake of the overeager first-time traveler. My children said I was too old for this. Maybe they were right." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, watching a group of schoolchildren chase pigeons in the castle courtyard. "You know what I learned after Harold died?" she said finally. "There's a difference between being old and being defeated. Old is just a number, defeated is a choice. I feel pretty defeated right now. Because you're human and you got sick. Because you pushed yourself to experience as much as possible and your body reminded you that you're not 25. That's not defeat, honey. That's just life." Or, she helped me find a quiet cafe where I could rest and eat something bland, and she stayed with me for 2 hours, telling stories about travel disasters she'd survived in places I'd never heard of. By the time we rejoined the group, I felt better physically, but more importantly, I felt less alone. The secret, Dorothy told me as we walked back to the bus, is not to let one bad day convince you that you can't do this. Travel isn't about being perfect or proving anything to anyone. It's about showing up and being open to whatever happens. Vienna was our final stop, and by then I'd found my rhythm. I'd learned to pace myself, to listen to my body, to ask for help when I needed it. I'd also learned that being alone didn't mean being lonely. Some of my best moments had been spent in solitude, absorbing the beauty around me, without having to share or explain or justify my reactions. I spent my last evening sitting in a cafe near the opera house, writing in the journal I'd started keeping. I wrote about the things I'd seen and done, but mostly I wrote about how different I felt. Stronger, braver, more curious about what else might be possible. I'd proven something to myself over these 2 weeks, something I'd needed to prove ever since that Sunday dinner when my children had dismissed my dreams as impractical and selfish. I'd proven that I was still capable of growth, of courage, of surprising myself. I'd proven that there were parts of me that had nothing to do with being anyone's mother or grandmother. Most importantly, I'd proven that it wasn't too late to become who I was supposed to be. The flight home felt different from the one that had brought me to Prague. I was still the same woman, but I carried myself differently. I talked to fellow passengers, helped a confused elderly man find his gate, navigated the customs process with confidence, born from 2 weeks of figuring things out in foreign languages. Lisa picked me up from the airport, and the first thing she said was, "You look different." "Different how?" "I don't know. Happier, maybe? More present." I thought about that as we drove through familiar streets that suddenly seemed smaller, more manageable than they had before I'd left. "How was it?" she asked. "Really? Not the postcard version?" So I told her. About Prague's golden light and Budapest's thermal baths, and the morning I got lost in Vienna and ended up discovering the most beautiful little park. About Dorothy and her 38 countries and the way she'd redefined what it meant to be old. About feeling scared and brave and capable all at the same time. "And you did all of this alone?" Lisa asked, her voice full of something I'd never heard before, respect, maybe, or admiration. "I did." "Mom, I owe you an apology. We all do." The family dinner that Sunday was different too. My children asked questions, real questions about my trip, about what I'd learned, about what I wanted to do next. Karen showed me photos from Emma's recital, but she also asked to see my pictures from Europe. James apologized for calling me selfish, and Michael admitted that he'd been impressed by my guts. But it was Emma, my 8-year-old granddaughter, who surprised me most. "Grandma, when I'm older, will you take me to see those castles?" "If you want to go," I said, "we'll figure out how to make it happen. Even if I'm really old, like 16? Especially if you're 16. That night, after everyone had gone home and I was loading the dishwasher from Sunday dinner, some things never change, I found myself thinking about Dorothy and her 38 countries, about all the places I'd never been and might still see if I was brave enough to keep traveling. I pulled out my laptop and started researching tours to Morocco. My children might think I'm too old for adventure, but I'm just getting started. There's a whole world out there I haven't seen yet, and I've got time. After all, I'm only 67. I'm not defeated. I'm not done. I'm just beginning.